So by now you probably figure out that I have a bit of an accent, and you may ask yourself, why does this person who's originally from the Netherlands, that's where I'm from, find himself in Las Vegas to talk about not just skyscrapers, but also about Las Vegas resorts. And I'll tell you a little bit of story about that. So about 20 years ago, I worked on as an architect in Amsterdam. I had never been to Las Vegas. On what was then the competition for the world's tallest tower, 2,000 feet tall. And to our surprise, we ended up winning the competition and building the tower. But perhaps what is even more interesting is that as we were putting the finishing touches on the design of the tower, our clients, and this was in Guangzhou in China, they visited Las Vegas. They went on a detour to Las Vegas, and upon their return, they told us their vision has changed. They wanted the flamboyance of the Bellagio fountains. In other words, they wanted Las Vegas. And so our tower ended up looking a little bit like Las Vegas, including these LED lights and this bubble tram that goes around the top to give people a view of the city. And right now it's the world's, or the city's most popular attractions. It's a city of about 15 million people. So then a couple of years later, I found myself strolling on the Las Vegas Strip, and I suddenly understood their fascination. And I decided to write a book about this topic. And you may find this an interesting choice, but for me, it has taught me many lessons about commercially successful buildings, as well as resorts. Because you could argue that in terms of resort design, if you look at the latest trends in Las Vegas, they really set the tone for resort design elsewhere. And the story of Las Vegas is really quite remarkable. It drives around the Strip, the economic engine of the city. Everywhere you look around you, 80 years ago, there was nothing. It was just desert. So in a period of 80 years, they built what was perhaps the world's most visited boulevard. In 2017, the city received 42 million visitors. That was 10 million more than Paris. So what's behind this story? I claim that architecture and the design of resorts played a very large role. It became a key aspect for Las Vegas to attract people like you, like convention goers, tourists, and many others. And how did they do that? Well, I claim that every 10 years, they change their image. There's kind of a reinvention of Las Vegas, or at least the Strip. If you look at the latest resorts, there's a new theme that becomes adopted. So that first theme 80 years ago was very far from what you see today. It was Wild West. So they were using, they had waiters dressed up as cowboys. They were giving out these unique Western experiences. There was a theme park the size of Disneyland when it opened, that was just with saloons and where you could shoot guns and have a Western style experience. Now there's one thing that not a lot of people know about Las Vegas, is that the first developers on the Las Vegas Strip, they were also movie theater operators. So these were people that had a very close connection with Hollywood and with movie stars. And this helped them to not only bring celebrities to Las Vegas, but also to stay up to date with all the current trends. And as soon as kind of a new type of movie became popular, and at that time it was Western movies, you would see that reflected in the architecture of the Las Vegas Strip. So this story that I'm about to tell will go from Western to astronauts to Disneyland. And those were some of the images that they adopted. So in the early 40s, they started with Western. By the late 40s, that theme was thrown out, and it was more of a mid-century modern theme. The other thing that's interesting is that when the first resort is built, the next resort wants to do a better job. So I'm sure you've all heard of the Flamingo, by Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, who was this gangster. So he built this Flamingo. It was way over budget, $6 million. He got killed for that, by the way. So yeah, just don't run any construction over budget. You know, you always get in trouble. But in this case, what's interesting is that the resort that came afterwards, the Thunderbird, went overboard with this bird idea, right? So instead of one single bird, they had two birds, and they were more voluptuous. So you already see that the sign becomes a really important part of distinguishing resorts. The second thing that becomes really important is the swimming pool. The first swimming pools in Las Vegas were very basic. They were just kind of rectangular. But then comes the Desert Inn, and it comes up with this keyhole-shaped pool. And resorts, they started to race around, you know, who had the biggest but also the most interesting shaped pool. And they virtually exploited every single letter in the alphabet. They were featuring floating crab tables and even underwater music to attract people. So this was in the 50s. And you know, if you look at some of the most current pools, they're really super cutting edge, and we'll get into that later. Now, the interesting thing is, you know, when a new resort comes and they present this newest vision, in this case, it was the, you know, this mid-century modern vision. It was focused around astronauts. All the old casinos, they kind of have to compete with that. So you see how a resort that was initially called the Last Frontier, over a period of one single day, they call it the Big Switch. They went from Last Frontier, or Western and cowboys, to New Frontier and astronauts and planets. So you see how they were very willing to adopt the latest theme just to attract people. The other thing you can see here is the focus around the porte cochere to become also a key aspect in which the developer starts to compete. So probably one of the most beautiful porte cocheres at the time was the Tropicana, which is this very beautiful crescent-shaped porte cochere that also lit from underneath. Sometimes you may ask yourself, there was an embracing of certain themes that, in hindsight, may have not been the best decision, including when they started the nuclear detonations in Las Vegas. Developers, and they really jumped on this with atomic-themed resorts, but also having Miss Atomic Bomb contests, even organizing picnics, so you could go to the detonation site and watch a nuclear detonation. So the next phase after that, I call Pop City, is because around this time, it all becomes around the sign. And popular imagery become really incorporated in the casino. And perhaps the most important example was the Stardust, which no longer exists. But the Stardust was a very basic building. You could almost call it an industrial building, of these kind of long corridors of bungalows that were laid out next to each other. The only thing that was special about it was the huge sign. So it's the sign that then became the most important. And there was an incredible race between developers. And as soon as one developer built up a sign, then the next developer wanted to build a much bigger sign. So, for instance, the Stardust, 10 years later, threw out its entire sign to build a much bigger one. And these were really quite advanced. They were incorporating the latest technology. As soon as new neon colors became available, they incorporated them in the facade. Now, sometimes there was a tension between signage and architecture. As you can imagine, if you would have stayed in this room, a couple days later you come back and your view over the desert is suddenly one that looks right into the back of a sign. But it's this period that a lot of architects know of Las Vegas, because there was a book that was published called Learning from Las Vegas by Denise Brown and Bob Venturi. And they claim that this architecture in which the sign was so dominant was much better than, let's say, the architects of modernists, because at least everybody can understand it. Everybody understands that this is the stardust, it has a planet, there's satellites. This is a much better way of communicating messages, they said. Now, if you're looking at what actually happened on the Strip, these were the world's largest signs, some of them up to 200 feet tall. They include tens of thousands of light bulbs and thousands of miles of neon. And these were deliberately featured in the advertising. So it became very much part of the publicity. Now today you may ask yourself, you probably wouldn't do that today. Advertise that you have used tens of thousands of light bulbs just to light up your building. But at the time, that became kind of a key distinguishing feature. If you look at the left picture, it shows a woman holding a hamburger and a Coke as a photo collage of one of the tallest signs. So there's an interesting tension that emerges around this time between the architect and the sign designer. And I want to show you some of that because in a way, Las Vegas very much, even today, as an architect, you don't have that much authority. It's really about whatever the developer wants. Still, there's a lot of architects who work here because these are massive projects and huge budgets. I want to tell you one story about the tension between the architect and the sign designer. So here you see the Aladdin sign, a very kind of beautiful sign. 10-story, the size of a 10-story building, and then here's the building behind it. And the story is about when the developer goes to meet the sign designer and the architect, when the sign designer is about to unveil his creation, a small model. So the architect was already in the room before the developer came, and he said, "God, I hate it. That's the ugliest thing I've ever seen in my life." Then the developer came in, and the architect said, "This isn't what you want." "No, I want to see it," said the developer. "Let me take a look at it." The developer was thrilled. "Oh my God, where do I sign?" Said the architect, "I knew you'd love it." So yeah, just to highlight some of the tension, because this era is really about the sign. And every time there was a sign opening, this was a huge part of the publicity. So you would have the mayor, a showgirl, and they would have this opening ceremony of the sign, which were really remarkable. So if you have time, I highly recommend the Neon Museum in Las Vegas. They have some of these old signs there. You can even see some of these old construction drawings. This is a construction drawing about the size of this wall, because it represents pretty much a building, a sign, with 2 elevators in it up that was 200 feet tall. On top of that, it was really quite sophisticated in terms of its animation sequences and how they use electronics to animate it. So in this case, it was a cloud that would kind of shimmer, and it would, the stars would fall down. That's the story of the Strip, right? Where the resorts are kind of spaced out quite a lot. So the experience is very different because everything is pretty remote. But when you go to downtown, that is a very different experience. And there was a very unique race happening there of so-called noses, or bullnose buildings. Those were signs that were on a corner, like the Golden Nugget here. So when you're on the corner, you kind of have a unique opportunity as a designer to really make a mark. So this was a very kind of famous bullnose, and then added the sign on top. Then came the horseshoe, which had the first concave nose to respond to that. And then one of my personal favorites, the Lucky Casino, which also had a concave nose, but then it had this long signage that emerged right from it. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a feeling how that experience was. So if you go there today, it's no longer like this. They covered it with an LED screen. I think they should remove it because I think the original was way better. And what was so interesting is that if you would have gone there at that time, it would have been a very bizarre experience, almost like being a piece of bread that's walking through a toaster, because it was that hot with all the light bulbs and all the clinking sounds. But yeah, this was truly innovative. There was nothing else in the world like this. Perhaps Times Square in New York or Ginza in Tokyo. But by and large, this was really very unique. Now I want to tell you another story about kind of the people behind this production, because you had actually a lot of metal workers that were responsible for these signs. These were sheet metal, mostly. It's like a silver slipper on the left. This is all built out of metal and light bulbs. The interesting part is that there was an entire crew of a company called Yesco, still exists today. It's a sign manufacturing company. And their task was to drive around the city and simply look out for black spots or dead spots whenever there was a light bulb that had to be changed. Now you can imagine that this person over here, Mr. Kemp, was a little bit of a road hazard as he was hanging out the window and literally looking for light bulbs that needed to be replaced. And apparently he only got a ticket once when he was about to run over a lady. But it was a very dangerous job and a very unique job, so I wanted to highlight that with this story. So with transformers going up to tens of thousands of volts, it was a very challenging job. I get shocked all the time, Kemp said. It's better than a morning cup of coffee. Kemp would also change the letters on the whiteboard sign panels. Those are the large letters you saw here, right? So they look small, but they're also the size of a two-story building, some of them. A real hard day is when you have to take Wayne Newton down and put Dean Martin up. So you go home physically and mentally exhausted. And with the Newton letters weighing between 50 and 75 pounds each, they are not easy to carry up, and they need ladder. I once got a hernia lifting Wayne Newton, he said. And like any bulb changer in the business, one fall was inevitable. Kemp was a 55 feet tumble from the Tropicana sign, tearing his ligaments and shattering his teeth. The other thing that's interesting that happens around this time is the emphasis around customer experience. And I call this 360-degree experience, that from the very moment you drive past the resort to the moment you park the car, to the moment you walk up to the receptionist, to the moment you walk to your room, from the moment you go to the restaurant, everything is according to a theme. And that kind of finds one of the first examples of was the Dome of the Sea. So deep sea exploration was popular at the time, with Jacques Picard going to the bottom of the ocean. And in Las Vegas, they tried to mimic this experience, give people a feeling of that experience by this kind of dome-shaped building that had this iridescent ceiling. And on top of that, there was this woman playing a harp that would go around figure eights through this pool, and this pool was bubbling with water, and there were all these projections of seaweed and fish. So apparently, this was a little bit too much, because people got seasick, unrelated to the escargot. But it's just one of the kind of early experiences of really catering around creating these fully immersive experiences that are not just visual but also very sensory. And if you're looking at the innovations, for instance, in terms of set design, on the right you see a stage piece called the Octopus, which was this series of hydraulic arms that had a disc, and it would move showgirls around. So no matter where you sat in the audience, you would have kind of a more intimate experience with that performance. Sometimes it went a little bit too much. Caesar's Palace is a good example. This was developed by a very flamboyant developer called Jay Sarno. And they really went over the top. So how did they do that? Well, first of all, if you were invited to the opening, a Roman centurion would come to your house with a parchment scroll that would be enrolled to invite you. If you're looking at the image on the left, there was a very elaborate grape treatment in which waiters or waitresses would come to you. They would introduce themselves by saying, "I am your slave," and then give you, they would have a bunch of grapes and then put them in your mouth as you finish the dessert. But perhaps the most extreme aspect of it, if you're looking at this pool in this image, is that Jay Sarno, he planned to have piranhas, the meat-eating fish, inside this pool, and then every night he was going to sacrifice a baby pig to pick up the pace after the entree service. Now, thankfully, the health department intervened, and that did not happen. But if you're looking at other pieces that really lasted, one of them was the immense setback that he created between the resort and the strip to create this monumental driveway. And what's unique about Caesar's Palace is one of the few resorts that still has that theme today, that old Roman theme that still resonates with many people. You could argue that it's no longer as interesting as it used to be because it's kind of become this sprawling complex of resorts, but nevertheless, it still works. There are also examples, situations in which it didn't quite work, including Circus Circus. So Circus Circus still exists today, but it's very different from when it first opened. When it first opened, there was a real circus act there. You had trapeze artists, you even had elephants, monkeys walking through the casino. They even, and I know this is true because I met the son of Jay Sarno just a couple of weeks ago. They even had a plan to have a trapeze elephant, a Siamese elephant that they would throw around the casino. The plan faltered when they realized it would require a lot of diapers, massive diapers, the elephant's excrement from flying through the casino. So this was not a success, and very quickly they closed down the casino. They created a separation between the casino and the gambling areas because Circus Circus was not a good place for serious gamblers, as you can imagine. So then the fourth phase is corporate modern. That's where we are today, or actually where we're staying right next door. It was much more focused around business and corporations. This was for the first time when, because of the Corporate Gaming Act, corporations were allowed to own and operate casinos. So major companies like the Hilton were able to come to Las Vegas. And actually this was where they had their most profitable hotels because of the casino. So right next door, the West Cape used to be the Hilton, and before that, it was the International. So it's a very different aesthetic. In terms of the sign, it went away from neon and it became more, what you see here, whiteboards, perhaps not as beautiful anymore, a little bit more bulky, but there's still a couple interesting examples that exist, like this one. So instead of the sign, you could argue that the new thing that really projects the identity of resorts was the porte cochere. So here's a couple examples. Caesar's Palace, which still exists today, has a very beautiful kind of tiered pagoda that exists. And if you're looking around, virtually every resort on the Strip has this massive cantilevering porte cochere. And sometimes they cover about 10 lanes, but these are massive structures. So then the fifth phase is Disneyland. So around this time, Disney emerges as the most profitable entertainment corporation, and Las Vegas developers decided to take some lessons from Las Vegas, and they started building theme park attractions to attract families, or at least people that do not, that prefer to travel with their children. So one of the first ones to do that was Steve Wynn with this erupting volcano, which was built right on the strip. Now, how can it be that when you're trying to build an addition to your house, it can take years, but in Las Vegas, they have an erupting volcano right on the strip, right? And you can imagine this really altered the traffic. Some people got out of their cars to see what was going on, as they never predicted there would be an erupting volcano right next to you. But yeah, it did do its job in kind of creating some action. And part of that was pyrotechnics. So Treasure Island was a pirate-themed resort. What's quite interesting here is that the designers of Treasure Island, they were actually designing in the method of Walt Disney. So that meant they had to wear pirate outfits. They had to say R a lot. And it was a design process that was really focused around creating images and these experiences. So they had this live performance on the strip of this ship that would be sunken by pirates. The other interesting piece is that they timed the implosion of one of the resorts, the dunes, with the opening of Treasure Island, and they scripted a movie out of this, which flopped. But you can imagine that if you were there at the opening, it would have been quite spectacular. So it was Steve Wynn who literally shot cannons to the dunes, and then the dunes was imploded. Now, part of this era is a huge emphasis around lagoons and having lots of water bodies, but also around nature, being in nature. The unique aspect of nature in Las Vegas is that about half of it is fake, and about half is real nature. So they blend real with fake to the extent that it's very hard to distinguish what is what. And if you quote some of the designers, they do that deliberately to make it seem more real than it actually is by using fake plants. It's a little bit of a contradiction. Now, part of the challenges as resort designers around that time is around, we're building these massive resorts that are thousands of rooms, sometimes 4,000 rooms. How can you still provide a boutique experience when you have the risk of, for instance, a tower that's starting to look like a maximum security prison, right? And we articulate all these individual windows. So one solution you can see in the Treasure Island is called the window eye effect, is when they cluster a couple of the windows together in a larger window. So even though this looks like it's just one room, it's actually 4 rooms. So there's various other strategies that they use to make buildings feel smaller. One of my personal favorites, although it's from a developer's perspective, it's maybe not the best example, is the Luxor, right? So what's nice about the Luxor for me is that a little bit, when everybody zigs, zag, right? So when everybody does, very light and bright and overlit buildings, this is just a dark pyramid that doesn't look like anything else, right? So it really sticks out by being dark in a way. From a developer's perspective, however, you can where are your most valuable floors? And in the upper levels, right? So in this case, you have a huge footprint and upper levels that are relatively small. So that is a challenge. The other challenge of this one, even though I still like it, it has this huge interior atrium, but then the top of it is blocked because they built this huge laser that shoots out in the top. So people say what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, not this laser beam. Apparently it's visible from outer space. But the problem with that beam is that it does block daylight, so it can feel a little bit claustrophobic in this very large space. I wanted to highlight a couple of mistakes that developers made. First of all, going solely after families didn't turn out to be very profitable, as you can imagine, because people who travel with their children, you don't find them very often behind, a slot machine or the crabs table. But there are some other mistakes that were made. So, for instance, this is the MGM Grand. They used to have this large lion head entrance And you would have to go into the mine, underneath the lion's mouth to get in. But apparently, Chinese gamblers saw that as something you should not do it, as something that gives you bad feng shui, bad luck. So this became a feng shui faux pas. Within a couple of years, it was demolished. The other example is the Landmark, which was a very beautiful resort, if you ask me. It's kind of a stem, circular stem built with rooms that are pie-shaped, and has this large saucer on the top. Those rooms were too small, and they imploded relatively quickly. Now, they were smart enough to feature this in the movie Mars Attack, so at least they took advantage of that implosion. Now, the sixth phase, about 20 years ago, is when they're going after what I call Sim City. They start to copy other cities. This is at a time when kind of neo-traditional architecture becomes popular. Think about the new urbanists, for instance, in their towns like Seaside, and they start to copy places like Venice, like New York. And part of the publicity was actually bragging about the accuracy of the copy, that it was really almost a one-to-one scale. Yeah, in some areas I think it works quite well. If you look at the New York, it's a massive single slab building, but in this case, by turning it into a skyline, it kind of breaks up that mass. And you could argue it creates for some perhaps better views, right? In Las Vegas, in New York, where I live, it's very hard to capture the Statue of Liberty with the skyline, right? But here, that's quite easy. And in some ways, you could argue that maybe the Las Vegas copy is a little bit better. So it's a great story about the Forever stamp, which was printed. Just after it was printed, somebody realized that the Statue of Liberty, as it appeared on the Forever stamp, was not the Statue of Liberty in New York, which was the institution they wanted to honor. Instead, it was the face of the Statue of Liberty in Las Vegas, which has a more feminine shape. And you can imagine why whoever designed this stamp was, picked this one by accident. Unfortunately, by the time the accident had come out, there were already billions of these stamps printed. And this is the Forever stamp. That's a stamp that never, ever expires. And you can imagine it led to great frustration in New York, but to great amusement in Las Vegas. And one of the spokesmen of MGM said, this is actually better because right now this stamp is honoring two institutions, the Statue of Liberty and Las Vegas, which I thought was a pretty smart answer. So you get this weird tension between the original and the replica. So the Paris Eiffel Tower, which goes through the Opera House, whereas the original one is, stands by itself. You get water that's more blue and clean than perhaps the original Venice. But by the late 90s, they're kind of moving away from that. Steve Wynn was really responsible for the first phase. It created the Bellagio and these spectacular fountains with a setback that was even more than Caesar's Palace. And theming becomes a little bit less pronounced. Steve Wynn, by the way, had a lot of interesting innovations, allowing daylight into some of the shopping corridors, for instance. We tend to believe that Las Vegas resorts are very much around confusing people and making sure that you design a maze that's kind of dark. That's only true for about 50% of the places. There's all these other places like the Encore, for instance, or the Bellagio that are not designed like that. And this research that's done, it turns out that both are equally profitable. So you can imagine the maze is profitable because you get lost and you find yourself as you go to the restroom behind the slot machine and probably more inclined to gamble. But the, let's say, more spectacular resort works out quite well too, because when you lose, apparently, you don't feel as bad because you have this more impressive space around you. So that's why there's kind of two models for casino design that you see in Las Vegas. The signs, they become more like monuments, so that's interesting, I would say. And the area of the one resort that really ended this paradigm was the Aladdin. It was themed, after some sort of, the Arabian Nights theme with, all these caves and this Middle Eastern village. But then 9 weeks after it opened, there was 9/11. And people deliberately avoided the Aladdin, while at the same time they left, or they celebrated New York, which is quite interesting. They started to drop a lot of memorabilia and souvenirs to honor the victims of 9/11. So almost after 9/11, that's when the Aladdin went bankrupt. And a couple of years later, it rebranded as Splendid Hollywood. It's still called that today. But it was a relatively light rebranding because thankfully they didn't theme the towers as much, so they could just paint it white. And all they did mostly was to change the podium building from these kind of fake caves to more like this media facade. Now the last phase, which is the phase we're still in, is star architecture. The most important project is Project City Center. It has really a collection of architectural marvels designed by people including Helmut Jahn, Daniel Libeskind, who did the mall, KPF, the firm I used to work for, did one of the hotels. So these are renowned companies that now design these resorts. There's also lots of art, expensive interior designers with really more sleek and minimalist interiors that are really quite different from that. At the same time, Las Vegas became a place not just of bare-breasted showgirls, but also very innovative forms of entertainment, like the work of Cirque du Soleil. Here you're looking at the show called Ka, and it has a stage that literally disappears, or it moves up and down. It's very, very innovative. The swimming pools merges into a nightclub. Why do they do that? Well, because now they can generate revenue at night and during the day. So if you're looking at the top 10 world's highest grossing nightclubs, 7 of them are in Las Vegas. And the city successfully rebranded itself from maybe a family destination to a destination that's also around nightlife, around entertainment, around bachelor parties. So it's a shift towards LEDs. You see that in downtown. There's this massive LCD screen. It's covering several city blocks, but perhaps the most famous example, and I hear some of you have visited, is the Sphere. Now, I knew the Sphere was going to be a success when I had some friends of mine from Europe text me, Stefan, is that a real project? Is there really a giant eyeball on the Las Vegas Strip? So yes, this thing went viral. And what I've been hearing from people, this is an incredible experience. The advertising rates are off the charts. I believe it's $400,000 per day to advertise on the Sphere. And it's really like 3 spheres, it's not just 1 sphere. You have the outer layer, the LEDs, you have some sort of a rain screen, and then you have the inner sphere. And altogether, it's more than 1.2 million LED lights designed by Populous, a very famous firm for designing stadiums. Now, if you're looking at the evolution of resorts in Las Vegas, it's really come a long way from these small bungalows to these podium towers to now a multi-tower, multi-podium type of projects like Project City Center. So that evolution is enormous. If you're looking at the tower design, which is the bread and butter of many of the architecture firms, it's really gone much more high-end, right? A lot of the first towers were all X-shaped, which meant that you don't have a good view. You always look into another room. Now a lot of the towers, like at city center, they're either bar-shaped or more like a square-shaped, so you have an unobstructed view. It's gotten a lot bigger, right? Where they used to be 1-, 2-story structures, now we're talking about high-rises, 40, 50-story buildings. And Las Vegas even has a Supertall, the stratosphere, which is taller than 1,000 feet. The tower design has become really quite sophisticated. And again, it goes back to the challenge that you have as a designer. How can you provide a boutique experience when you're really catering to thousands of people? So if you're looking at the wind tower, for instance, instead of putting the penthouse on the top for the VIPs of the Wells, they actually created a separate tower that's part of this complex with its own elevator court. And around the elevator court, they have kind of the highest end restaurant, so you never have to walk too far if you're a VIP customer. They even have your own entrance to a pool, which is elevated over the common pool. So they almost create like 2 worlds within one single entity. There's still mistakes that happen, including what has been nicknamed the death ray. It's a concave building that's all glass. You can imagine in the summertime, as the sun shines on that, it converges all the rays, and sadly, it moves them all towards the swimming pool. So this has led to some people complaining about burning cups, but even scorching their hair. The irony is that the designer, Rafael Vignoli, has made a similar mistake in one of his other buildings, the walkie-talkie in London, which is also kind of this concave shape. And there, I would say it's much worse because you get those rays on public places, right? So these are literally burning holes in cars. One of the architecture critics, they call it the fry scraper, because you can fry an egg on the sidewalk to do that. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Las Vegas is how it's really internationalized its product. So Las Vegas Sands, which was a Las Vegas native company, is now a global corporation, and you could argue that some of the resorts it's put outside Las Vegas are even better than the ones you get here, right? So Las Vegas Sands is the company behind the Venetian. If you go to Singapore, there's not a Venice-themed casino. This is an integrated resort that includes a museum. It's 3 towers, interior atriums, has this elevated part, 700 with an infinity pool that gives you views 700 feet above the city. Designed by the star architect, and very much it became the center of this new central business district in Marina Bay, in Singapore. So you have a Las Vegas company building that icon. That's not to say that the city has challenges of its own. For the 20th century, the Las Vegas metropolitan area was the fastest growing city in America. And what happened as a result is that it's really kind of a sprawling city, right, with cheap desert land. It really kind of just moved outwards and outwards and causing lots of issues, including traffic, but also landscaping of water requirements that has led to some glaring contradictions, just to highlight a couple of them. So as the city itself is sprawling outwards, kind of eating away some of the hillsides, you get this artificial topography on the strip. As Lake Mead is at its lowest ever levels, this is the chief water source for Las Vegas, you see these massive ponds of water where water is being evaporated every minute, like the Bellagio. Now, I want to emphasize that this is not something that most people know, but Las Vegas is actually very innovative in terms of water use. And they use what they call the return flow credit, which means that they only draw about 2% of the water supply of the Colorado River. And this for the whole state of Nevada. And why can they survive with only so little water? Is because they return all of their wastewater back into Lake Mead through this Las Vegas wash. This is not something they advertise because you can imagine the term we like to call it is a toilet to tap.
Gray water.
Toilet to tap, yeah, gray water.
Gray water.
You don't want to know that the same water that you drink from the tap or you shower is also, you know, a couple days ago was the wastewater that just flushed down the toilet, right? But nevertheless, it is very innovative in terms of its water usage. If you're looking at some of the more contemporary projects, like the park, Las Vegas, on the Strip, is designed by a very good friend of mine, Jerry van Eyck. He's also Dutch. It's what they call a xeriscape. It's used very little water to irrigate the plants, so it's using a lot of native vegetation. And this is, you know, private space. It's owned by MGM, but it's become a very popular hangout. So we associate the Strip with resorts, casinos, and car-centric places, but more and more it's becoming pedestrian and even with pieces of nature. Then we have the solar roofs, right? So a lot of the resorts, they're covered in photovoltaics. Some of the country's largest solar plants are out in the Mojave Desert, allowing these resorts to generate their own electricity. So in short, it's really quite spectacular how the Strip has evolved through its unique design innovation into what was kind of a low-rise commercial corridor, into a high-rise boulevard. And the city has really gone from being almost nothing to you know, a city of skyscrapers. And this brings me to my second book, which is focused on tall buildings. That's, you know, where I started as an architect. And it's that story of cities densifying, kind of embracing skyscrapers that you don't just see in Las Vegas, but you see it across the world. And yeah, I was fortunate to be able to work on several of these very tall buildings. And I published a book that just came out last year called Supertall. And it's about this new generation of skyscrapers, on one hand, and the technology that makes them possible. But also the global race around building these and how, very similar to Las Vegas, developers want to outdo each other to create the next most spectacular project. So here you see a New York Times book review about the book. They feature the Marina Bay Sands, which is you know, the Las Vegas Sands company behind it. So this is a story that's not just valid for you know, America and Asia, right? But even for Europe, from Europe, from cities that traditionally shun high rises, like London, like Paris, are now seeing Supertalls, which are, you know, buildings taller than 1,000 feet. We see buildings that are incredibly innovative, no longer this skyscrapers we think about when we're thinking about maybe the Chrysler Building or the Empire State Building. These are towers that are interconnected with the sky bridges, leaning towers, almost deliberately, like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. We have eroding towers that really seem to defy gravity, and we have twisting towers. So I wanted to show you the twisting tower I worked on and kind of tell you the story behind that, the Canton Tower. So how was it possible that we, as a very small team in Amsterdam, were able to win this competition? It was because if you're looking at TV towers, they were not that innovative at the time. They were mainly like a little bit like a chef's stick, you know, you got a stick and a pod. So what we decided to do was something different that used a different type of geometry. It's called the hyperboloid. I'll get into that later. But also something that was asymmetrical. Because a lot of the TV towers, because they have this kind of circular base and the circular pod, they look the same from every angle of the city. But because you have such a big tower, you see it from everywhere. Once you create an asymmetrical profile, it becomes more interesting as you go about the city. It looks different from every angle. So this geometry, called the hyperboloid, was already built on a much smaller scale by a Russian engineer called Vladimir Shukov. And at the time, he wanted to build something taller than the Eiffel Tower. He didn't succeed. They didn't have enough steel. And And during construction, there were several accidents, so they built it much smaller. But what's so fascinating about this geometry that it's much more efficient than the traditional arch geometry, because you're dealing with a double curved surface that's only made out of straight elements, so it's relatively easy to fabricate. And that surface, because you can imagine, if you have, let's say, I'm sure you see that, but if you have a parallel force on the building, the lateral force, which is a dominant force of skyscrapers, it finds a more easy path down, straight all the way down through these kind of straight columns. So as a result of this unique geometry, they were able to achieve the same height, hypothetically, with only like a third of the material. So why did they never build this up until our tower? Because of the lack of technology. It would have been very expensive to have all these joints that are very different. So we deviated from this hyperboloid shape by twisting it and give it this kind of narrow profile. And then we filled the whole tower with program. So you could really experience it. So usually a TV tower, you just go to the top and that's it. But here we had several experience moments. And we used, at the time, it was quite novel to use 3D printing and laser cutting to exhibit that. But here you see some of the beauty of this system is that even though you have a double curved surface, you still have to rely on kind of these straight columns, right? And we call this also a ruled surface. Now, one of the biggest challenges was to make sure that the tower had a narrow waist. Now, what drives that thickness? It's very much the elevated core, right? Because the elevated core is partially structural, partially it's egress, so that people need to evacuate safely. You need to get people up. There's a lot of elevators. You have double-decker elevators that shoot all the way to the top. You have more local elevators. And then it has all the services as well. So this core tends to expand. So we spend a lot of time keeping the core as small as possible to give the tower a narrow waist. And today, the nickname in China of this tower is Xiao Man Yao, which means girl with a slim waist. The other challenge was, this relatively complicated geometry had never built this scale to 1,000 feet. The other challenge was this is a typhoon climate, not exactly the most friendly environment for these experimentation. So we had to really show that the system would hold up. There was a shaking table test, wind tests, but it turns out that twisting towers perform much better than regular square or even round towers. It's for this kind of nerdy thing that happens. It's called the vortex shedding that happens when you have a kind of a square shape or a round shape, which means that when the wind blows around the round shape, you get these alternating wind forces that start to pull against the building, and this could really be quite dangerous, and it could lead to collapse. But by having kind of a asymmetrical profile, you don't get that vortex shedding effect. On top of that, we installed 600 structural health monitoring sensors that give live performance data of this structure. And apparently it was the first time that was done at this scale. We also used parametric design to reduce the number of nodes. As you can imagine, the most expensive piece of this building is the structure. It's basically the structure. But then how can we drive the cost down? Is by reducing the number of nodes and increasing the number of similar pieces. So that became then an exercise, and afterwards the whole thing was painted, so you don't see that part of the puzzle anymore. What's nice about this tower, because it's kind of a hollow tower for most of the areas, that you can create these unique experiences that you can't get in other observation towers. So here you have these skywalks that take people through. They have since designed more spectacular, more scary skywalks that don't just take you around the surface, but also across the tower. And there's these skyboxes that take you out, and so you kind of look down on the city. So that was that project. Now I guess the interesting part of the project is that it was only the world's tallest tower for about a couple of weeks when it topped out, because then the Burj Khalifa came, which I'm sure you know about. This is still the world's tallest tower, and that took over the title. So that's kind of what happened. But what makes these towers so interesting for me, and this is how I'm also a professor and work with students, is that when you're doing a tower this tall, it makes sense to understand the structure, right? It's the structure that becomes the most important cost driver. If you can design a smarter structure, then you can save material, you can save costs. And what I like is that gives you an excuse to actually create very beautiful shapes that are both beautiful structurally and efficient structurally, but also architecturally. And perhaps one of the latest things you can use is topology optimization, which allows you to run these simulations in computers to minimize the amount of material. You're saying like 3D printing something. And you can also apply that to skyscraper design, because on the left you see a truss. A skyscraper is essentially a truss. It's just 90 degrees rotated, right? So
you build scale models of this stuff before you build
yes,
it?
yeah. Well, all of these towers, they go through wind tunnel testing, which is still very much a, you print the model and you test it. Even though there's digital simulation techniques, they still use kind of physical models to test that. And some architecture firms, like SOM, for instance, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, based out of Chicago, they have their own wind tunnel in-house because they do a lot of tall buildings. Now, what are other things you can think about? So, when you're designing resorts, so this is a project I worked on in Batam, just outside of Singapore. Developer wanted to really create a dense site. How do you maximize views for all of the units? And so you can create these optimization algorithms to see, okay, what is the ideal angle for each of the volumes. The other trend that we're seeing is including greenery. In some cities, they make it mandatory, like Singapore. So they have what they call landscape replacement areas, which means that if you as a developer, you have a piece of land you want to build a tower on, you have to replace the land that is lost to the development, to the footprint of the development, with greenery in the sky. And sometimes they do that more than 10 times. And you really see these incredible green buildings, and they're very sophisticated. So it's not just about any blade of grass that you can plant. They measure what they call the leaf area index, which is the amount of surface area per unit of ground surface. Because the more surface area you have, the more benefits you have in terms of reducing temperature, reducing carbon emissions, and so on. The other thing we're seeing in Singapore is not just green buildings, but also these sky bridges. And believe it or not, this is a public housing project. So very often we associate skyscrapers with luxury, but it shows that it doesn't need to be that way. And Singapore has many examples of skyscrapers that are actually public housing. So here, if you would live here, you'd be able to have your morning jog 500 feet in the sky over this elevated platform. Transit integration is another key theme. Some cities are really good at that, like Hong Kong. I lived there for 3 years. So it's really incredible. If you're looking at this image, you're looking at the ceiling of a train station. And we have these towers that are built right on top. So if you live there, live in one of those towers for a couple months, you can just take the elevator down. You walk for a couple minutes, and you're on the train track. You can be at the airport in 20 minutes. Very different experience from my Uber ride yesterday as I landed here, which alone took 30 minutes for this Uber to arrive, right? And then only to be stuck in traffic. So Hong Kong does that really, really well. And in this complex, for instance, you have about 40,000 people that live, work, and play in this single project. The other trend that we're seeing is what we call kind of humanizing the skyscraper, right? If you would build a tower all the way to meet the ground without thinking about human skill, it could really potentially overwhelm people. So there are very good examples like Vancouver, in which they marry the tower to the townhouse, and we call that Vancouverism. It's become a verb. Mixed use, so not just office towers, which we associate with skyscrapers. Today's towers, they include retail, hotel, office, all into a single complex. What's fascinating about that is that that works out quite well, because your upper stories structurally make more sense to be a little bit smaller, so that is better for residential apartments or hotels, whereas the larger floors at the bottom, they may be good for retail or office. A double skin facade, like the tower designed by Gensler Shanghai Tower, it has two facades. In the middle, it has this atrium, so this effectively provides a buffer zone, reduces the need for heating and cooling. External shading, glass towers or glass buildings are great for growing tomatoes, but they're not very good for people. So even in a very cool climate, because of the sun, they will heat up and really make you reliant on air conditioning. So a lot of towers now incorporate external shading, and this can be part of the aesthetic. Less glass. Now glass is great for looking out, but it's also a very poor insulator. So how do we improve what we call the window-wall ratio? Have less window, more wall, but still have this glossy aesthetic. So ceramics, for instance, as you see on the right side, is making a comeback. Kind of the old traditional building material, it's still very glossy and it can be very beautiful. Natural ventilation. How do you deal with, you're on an upper story, normally if you would just open your window, because of the pressure differential between inside and outside the building, it would just slam open your window. So there's lots of new innovations that have these interior courtyards that also help with cooling, but allow you to naturally open your windows. Timber, right? So moving away from concrete, and also including timber. Very often these are hybrid buildings. This is one of the areas I've been focusing on. The beauty of timber is that it's very easy to prefabricate. It's much lighter than concrete, 5 times lighter. So it makes a lot of sense for modular type of buildings like residential hotels. So how do you use that modular element and make sure it's not just something that becomes plain and monotonous, but actually becomes something that is beautiful. So it's one of my focus. The other thing is kinetic facades, which we're starting to see too. Facades that respond to the time of day, reduce the amount of solar radiation that shines on the glass, but still be responsive to people's need for views. So the Al Bahar Towers in Abu Dhabi is one example. Energy generating. Wind turbines, including them in buildings, sometimes even shaping the geometry of the building in such a way that you can absorb wind better, like the Pearl River Tower designed by SOM in Guangzhou. And finally, this brings me back to Las Vegas, LED lighting integration. And you could say no one does it better than Las Vegas, right? So in conclusion, where does this leave us? So if there's one thing that you can take away from these projects, both Las Vegas and the Supertalls, it's the power of transformation. To create something out of nothing. And this is a lesson, I believe, that's valid for cities, for companies, as for life. To achieve big dreams, you need to have a vision of yourself, your company, beyond your current circumstances. But in order to do something you have never done before, you have to be great enough to give up who you are today and start thinking about who you want to become in the future. And as these projects show us, and so does Las Vegas, sometimes you just have to take a chance and believe in yourself. Thank you.